Subscribe to Storylab for more stories. Now, let's begin this one. Chapter 1. The Perfect Life. Raymond Barber stood at his kitchen window, watching the morning sun cast long shadows across his manicured lawn. At 42, he possessed the kind of lean, weathered face that spoke of years spent in places that didn't exist on any public map. His gray eyes, cold as winter steel, surveyed his domain with the same methodical precision he'd once used to identify enemy positions in Syria. 20 years of marriage to Karen had given him this. A colonial house in Virginia's horse country, a successful consulting business that served as cover for his real work, and a son who'd just turned 18. To the neighbors, Raymond Barber was a mild-mannered security consultant who traveled frequently for work. They had no idea that their quiet neighbor had eliminated more targets than most soldiers' fire bullets. "Coffee's ready," Karen called from behind him, her voice carrying that practiced warmth she'd perfected over the years. At 39, she remained striking. Auburn hair that caught the light just so, green eyes that could shift from loving to calculating in a heartbeat, and a smile that had once made him believe in fairy tales. Raymond turned, accepting the mug with hands that had never trembled, not even when he'd spent 72 hours in a Kandahar safe house with Taliban fighters searching door to door. "Jordan's still sleeping? You know, teenagers." Karen's laugh sounded forced. "He'll surface around noon, demanding food." Their son Jordan had inherited his mother's auburn hair and his father's analytical mind, though lately, Raymond had noticed a distance in the boy's demeanor. At 18, Jordan should be preparing for college, but instead, he seemed perpetually on edge, avoiding eye contact during family dinners. Raymond's phone buzzed, a text from his handler. "Package delivery complete. Enjoy your vacation." 3 months of deep cover work in Eastern Europe had finally ended. 3 months of eliminating a human trafficking network while officially consulting on security protocols for various corporations. "I have to leave again next week," Raymond said, testing the waters. He'd been watching, calculating, for the past 6 months. Little things had changed. Karen's phone habits, her sudden interest in yoga classes that ran suspiciously long, the way Jordan flinched whenever Raymond entered her room. So soon, Karen's response came too quickly, with too much relief barely concealed beneath manufactured disappointment. "How long this time?" 2 weeks. Maybe 3. Raymond studied her face, cataloging every micro-expression. In Chechnya, reading faces had meant the difference between a successful extraction and a body bag. Here, in his own kitchen, he was reading the face of a woman planning his destruction. "Well," Karen said, turning back to the coffee maker, "at least that gives us time to plan Jordan's graduation party." Raymond nodded, but his mind was elsewhere. Last month, while officially in Prague, he'd used agency resources to investigate his family. What he discovered would have broken a weaker man. Karen's affair with Norman Hansen, his own business partner, had been going on for 8 months. But that wasn't the worst part. The worst part was the plan. Norman Hansen was everything Raymond pretended to be, a legitimate security consultant with government contracts and a spotless record. At 45, Norman was handsome in that politician way, with silver-touched temples and a smile that had charmed its way into boardrooms across D.C. He was also ambitious, desperate, and drowning in gambling debts that his legitimate business couldn't cover. The plan was elegant in its simplicity. Karen would inherit Raymond's life insurance and the business. Norman would finally have access to Raymond's client list, clients who paid premium rates for services that required a very particular skill set. Together, they could build an empire on Raymond's corpse. But they needed Raymond dead, not divorced. Dead, and preferably disgraced, so no one would look too closely at the circumstances. Raymond's secure phone buzzed again. This time, it was a message from Luther Gibbons, his tech specialist. Target acquired unusual financial activity. Suggest immediate review. "I need to run some errands," Raymond announced, finishing his coffee. "Tell Jordan I'll be back for dinner." Karen nodded absently, already reaching for her phone. Raymond noted the timing. She'd wait exactly 10 minutes after he left, then make a call. The same pattern for the past 3 months. As Raymond drove toward the nondescript office building that housed his real operations, he allowed himself a cold smile. Karen and Norman thought they were the predators in this scenario. They had no idea they were being hunted by someone who'd made killing into an art form. The office building appeared to house various small businesses, an accounting firm, a travel agency, a law office. In reality, the entire third floor belonged to Barber Consulting, and Barber Consulting answered to people whose names appeared on no organizational charts. Luther Gibbons was waiting in the secure conference room, his laptop displaying financial records that painted a very clear picture. At 28, Luther looked like every other tech worker in D.C., glasses, unkempt hair, and the pallor of someone who lived on energy drinks and code. But Luther could crack any system, trace any transaction, and make digital evidence appear or disappear at will. Norman's been busy, Luther said without preamble. $73,000 in gambling debts to Preston Marshall's operation. Marshall's the type who breaks kneecaps first, asks questions later. Raymond studied the financial trail. Timeline. Based on payment schedules, Norman has maybe 6 weeks before Marshall decides to make an example of him. 6 weeks. Raymond processed this information with the same detachment he'd once used to plan extractions in hostile territory. What about the insurance policy? Luther pulled up another screen. Modified 3 months ago. Karen convinced you to increase the payout to $2 million plus business assets. She was very thorough. Got you to sign during one of your romantic dinners at Romano's. Raymond remembered that dinner. Karen had been unusually affectionate, unusually persuasive. She'd framed it as practical planning, protecting their family's future. He'd signed because the man she was asking, the security consultant who traveled for work, would have signed. The predator inside him had been watching, learning, planning. Anything else? Luther hesitated. Your son, Raymond. The phone records show he's been in contact with both Karen and Norman. Heavy conversation volume over the past month. Raymond felt something cold settle in his chest. Jordan wasn't just a bystander. He was part of the plan. His own son, the boy he'd taught to ride a bike and throw a baseball, was helping orchestrate his murder. Show me the details. The phone records painted a clear picture. Jordan had been recruited gradually, probably convinced that Raymond was somehow dangerous, that Karen was in danger. Norman, with his practiced charm, had likely played the role of protector, the man who would save Karen and Jordan from the mysterious, violent work that Raymond claimed was just consulting. One more thing, Luther said quietly. I traced the source of the plan. It wasn't Karen's idea originally. Raymond looked up sharply. Norman approached her. He's been investigating you for months, trying to figure out what you really do, who you really work for. He found enough to know that Raymond Barber, security consultant, is cover for something much more dangerous and potentially profitable. The picture was complete now. Norman had seduced Karen not just for her body, but for access to Raymond's life. He'd manipulated Jordan into believing his father was a threat. And now they were all working together to destroy the man who'd built everything they wanted to steal. Raymond stood, his decision crystallizing with the cold clarity that had served him in a dozen war zones. Luther, I need you to prepare a package. Everything we have on all of them. And I need you to reach out to Wade Duke. Luther's eyes widened. Wade Duke was legendary in their circles. A cleaner who specialized in making problems disappear permanently. Raymond, are you sure about this? I'm sure about one thing, Raymond said, his voice carrying the same tone he'd used when ordering the elimination of terrorist cells. They want to destroy Raymond Barber, the family man. Time to introduce them to the other Raymond Barber. As he left the office, Raymond was already planning. Not just their deaths. That would be too simple, too clean. He was planning their complete destruction, a campaign that would strip away everything they thought they wanted before finally taking their lives. By the time he returned home for dinner, Karen had already made her scheduled call to Norman. Jordan was sullen and avoiding eye contact. Both of them were playing their parts perfectly. Raymond smiled across the dinner table, asking about their days, commenting on Jordan's college plans. Inside, he was counting down, not to his own destruction, but to theirs. The war had begun. They just didn't know it yet. Chapter 2. The Seduction of Betrayal. Norman Hansen's office occupied the corner suite of a glass tower in Rosslyn, its floor-to-ceiling windows offering a commanding view of the Potomac. The space was designed to impress. Leather furniture, abstract art, and a bar cart that had entertained senators and Pentagon officials. Today, however, Norman was entertaining Karen Barber, and the stakes were far higher than any government contract. "He suspects something," Karen said, pacing behind Norman's desk. Even in distress, she moved with the calculated grace of a woman who'd learned to use her beauty as a weapon. "Last night, he asked about my yoga classes." "He never asks about yoga." Norman watched her move, admiring the way afternoon sunlight caught in her auburn hair. 3 years ago, when Raymond had brought him into the consulting business, Norman had seen Karen as just another businessman's wife. But as the months passed, as Norman began to understand the vast network of contacts and contracts that Raymond controlled, Karen had transformed from a pleasant distraction into an essential component of his survival. "Raymond's trained to notice patterns," Norman said, his voice carrying the smooth confidence that had convinced 3 wives to marry him and 2 to forgive his infidelities. "We just need to be smarter about ours." The affair had begun innocently enough. A comforting shoulder when Raymond missed Jordan's birthday due to an emergency deployment. A lunch that ran long when Karen needed to vent about her husband's increasingly frequent absences. Norman had recognized the opportunity and seized it with the ruthless efficiency of a man drowning in debt. Preston Marshall's organization didn't forgive $73,000 in gambling losses, and Norman's legitimate business couldn't generate that kind of cash quickly enough. But Raymond Barber's client list, if Norman could access it, represented millions in potential revenue. Defense contractors, private military companies, corporations with operations in hostile territories. They all paid premium rates for Raymond's particular expertise. The problem was Raymond himself. Norman had spent months trying to understand what his business partner actually did during those extended overseas trips. The clients were real, the contracts legitimate, but something didn't add up. No security consultant commanded the kind of respect and money that Raymond routinely received. It was Karen who provided the first real clue. "Sometimes he comes home different," she confessed during one of their early lunches. "Colder, distant, and there are things he'll know fact about people he's never met, details about situations that were never on the news." Norman had begun his investigation carefully, using his own government connections to probe the edges of Raymond's world. What he discovered had both terrified and excited him. Raymond Barber wasn't just a security consultant. He was something far more dangerous, far more valuable. "We need to move faster," Norman said now, pouring himself a scotch despite the early hour. "My situation with Marshall is becoming critical." Karen stopped pacing, her green eyes sharp with calculation. "Jordan's ready. I've spent months preparing him, showing him evidence of Raymond's real work." The manipulation of Jordan had been Karen's masterpiece. Forged documents suggesting Raymond was involved in assassinations, carefully edited photos placing him at scenes of violence, fictional therapy sessions where Karen confessed her fear of her husband's increasingly erratic behavior. Jordan, already resentful of his father's constant absences, had been primed to believe the worst. "And the old woman?" Norman asked. Karen's expression hardened. "Mother's been asking too many questions about our finances, about you." She threatened to tell Raymond about the insurance policy changes. Marilyn McConnell had been an unexpected complication. At 73, Karen's mother possessed the sharp instincts of a woman who'd survived the Depression and 2 wars. She'd noticed the changes in her daughter's behavior, the expensive gifts that Norman had been buying, the subtle shifts in family dynamics. Worst of all, she'd begun investigating Norman himself, using her retired teacher's network to uncover uncomfortable truths about his gambling debts and business failures. "She has to be eliminated," Norman said quietly. "And Raymond has to be blamed." The plan they developed was ambitious in scope. Marilyn would die during one of Raymond's overseas trips, but evidence would suggest he'd returned secretly to commit the murder. Jordan would provide testimony about his father's violent tendencies, and suspicious behavior. Karen would be the grieving daughter and terrified wife, seeking protection from a man who'd finally crossed the line from professional killer to domestic murderer. The timing has to be perfect, Karen said. Raymond leaves for Prague next week. That gives us a narrow window. Norman nodded, pulling up travel schedules on his laptop. I've already arranged for documentation, placing him back in the country. Credit card usage, cell phone pings, even surveillance footage, all of it will point to Raymond returning to kill your mother. The beauty of the plan lay in its believability. Raymond Barber, the mysterious consultant with no visible means of supporting his lifestyle, finally exposed as the killer he'd always been. No one would look too closely at the evidence when it confirmed what many had already suspected. And after? Karen asked. After, you're a widow with a $2 million insurance payout and a business that I'll help you run. Jordan testifies at the trial, confirms our story, and then goes off to college with a trust fund that ensures his silence. Norman had spent considerable time working on Jordan, positioning himself as the protective figure the boy had never had. While Raymond was overseas killing strangers, Norman was attending Jordan's basketball games, helping with college applications, becoming the father figure that the boy craved. What about Jordan's testimony? Karen asked. He's still hesitant about some details. Leave Jordan to me, Norman said confidently. I've been building his anger for months. By the time we need him to testify, he'll genuinely believe Raymond is a monster who needed to be stopped. The phone on Norman's desk buzzed, his assistant announcing that Preston Marshall was in the building. Norman felt his stomach tighten. Marshall's visits were never social calls. I have to take this meeting, Norman told Karen. But remember, 1 week from today, this all begins. After that, there's no going back. Karen kissed him goodbye, a gesture that would have seemed innocent to any observer. But Norman could feel the steel beneath her soft lips, the calculated passion of a woman who decided that love was less important than survival. As she left, Preston Marshall entered, a bear of a man whose expensive suits couldn't hide the violence that lurked beneath his polished exterior. At 55, Marshall had built an empire on other people's weaknesses, and Norman's gambling debts were just another investment to be collected. Norman, Marshall said, settling into the leather chair across from the desk. We need to discuss your payment schedule. I understand the timeline, Norman replied, fighting to keep his voice steady. 2 weeks, as agreed. Marshall smiled, the expression never reaching his cold eyes. Actually, the timeline has changed. Some of my associates feel that $73,000 is a significant amount. They worry about setting precedents. Norman felt sweat beading on his forehead. I have a business transaction closing next week. Full payment, plus interest. I hope so, Marshall said, standing to leave. Because if this transaction doesn't close, we'll need to have a different kind of conversation. The kind that involves your kneecaps and a baseball bat. After Marshall left, Norman sat alone in his office, staring out at the Potomac and calculating odds. Everything depended on the next week going perfectly. Marilyn McConnell had to die. Raymond had to be framed. The insurance money had to be collected. Because if any part of the plan failed, Norman Hansen would disappear into the kind of shallow grave that dotted the Virginia countryside, another casualty of Preston Marshall's particular brand of debt collection. The irony wasn't lost on him. In trying to destroy Raymond Barber, Norman had become exactly the kind of desperate, dangerous man that Raymond had spent his career eliminating. But it was too late for second thoughts. The plan was in motion, and Norman Hansen was committed to seeing it through to its bloody conclusion. Chapter 3. The Mother's Discovery. Marilyn McConnell had survived the London Blitz, buried 2 husbands, and raised 3 children through economic uncertainty and social upheaval. At 73, her silver hair was always perfectly styled, her spine straight as a ruler, and her blue eyes missed nothing. She possessed the kind of indomitable spirit that had once held together an entire generation, and she was not about to let some smooth-talking charlatan destroy her daughter's life. Sitting in her modest apartment in Alexandria, Marilyn spread financial documents across her dining room table like a general planning a military campaign. 3 months of investigation had revealed patterns that deeply disturbed her. Bank statements, credit reports, and property records painted a picture of deception that went far beyond simple marital infidelity. $73,000, she murmured, circling the figure on Norman Hansen's financial disclosure. In gambling debts to people who break bones for a living. Marilyn had learned about debt collection the hard way during her second marriage. Her late husband, Theodore, had been a good man with bad judgment and worse luck at cards. She'd watched the spiral begin, the lies, the desperation, the gradual transformation of a gentle man into someone she barely recognized. It had taken years to dig out of that hole, and Theodore had died still making payments to men who measured interest in bruises and broken fingers. Now she was seeing the same pattern in Norman Hansen, the man who'd somehow convinced her daughter to risk everything for love. The phone rang, interrupting her concentration. "Mrs. McConnell? This is Detective Ralph Stokes with Alexandria PD. You called about investigating financial fraud." Marilyn had spent weeks deciding whether to involve law enforcement. Raymond might be absent and distracted, but he wasn't stupid. If she moved too quickly, if she revealed her suspicions before gathering irrefutable proof, Norman might convince Karen to disappear entirely. "Detective Stokes, thank you for returning my call. I believe my daughter is being manipulated by a man with serious financial problems and connections to dangerous people." "Ma'am, with respect, adults are allowed to make their own romantic choices, even poor ones." "This isn't about romance," Marilyn said sharply. "This is about insurance fraud and conspiracy. I have evidence that Mr. Hansen is planning to steal my son-in-law's business and assets." She discovered the insurance policy changes by accident, helping Karen organize her filing system during one of their monthly dinners. The $2 million life insurance policy on Raymond had been modified just 3 months ago, with Karen as the sole beneficiary. When Marilyn had asked about it, Karen had deflected, claiming it was routine financial planning. But Marilyn knew better. Routine financial planning didn't require secret meetings with insurance agents or forged signatures on documents that Raymond had supposedly signed while overseas. "I'll need to see this evidence," Detective Stokes said. "But I should warn you, these kinds of domestic situations are complicated. Sometimes family members see conspiracy where there's just poor judgment." Marilyn understood the detective's skepticism. She'd sounded paranoid even to herself when she'd first started investigating. But months of careful research had revealed connections that went far beyond infidelity. Norman Hansen wasn't just sleeping with her daughter. He was positioning himself to inherit Raymond's entire operation. And that operation, Marilyn had discovered, was far more complex and valuable than any security consulting business had a right to be. "Detective, I'm 73 years old. I've seen men lie, cheat, and steal in pursuit of money and power. I know the difference between poor judgment and criminal conspiracy." After hanging up, Marilyn returned to her documents. The most damning evidence was hidden in the business partnership agreements. 3 months ago, Norman had convinced Raymond to modify their contract, giving Norman access to client information in the event of Raymond's death or incapacity. Combined with the insurance policy changes, it created a clear financial motive for murder. But there was more. Marilyn had used a retired teacher's network to investigate Norman's background, calling former colleagues who'd worked in D.C. school administration. What she'd learned painted a picture of a man whose ambitions had always exceeded his abilities. Norman Hansen had been married 3 times, each marriage ending when his wives discovered his gambling problems. He defaulted on business loans, filed for bankruptcy twice, and survived only by leveraging his government connections to secure contracts that his company couldn't properly fulfill. Now he was drowning in debt to Preston Marshall, a man whose reputation for violence was whispered about in D.C.'s corridors of power. Marilyn's phone buzzed with a text from Karen. "Having dinner with Jordan tonight. Norman's taking us to that new place in Georgetown." The casual mention of Norman's involvement in family activities made Marilyn's blood pressure spike. For months, Norman had been inserting himself into Jordan's life, attending school events that Raymond missed, providing the fatherly attention that the boy craved. Jordan, already resentful of his father's frequent absences, had begun to see Norman as a more reliable male figure. But Marilyn suspected there was more to Norman's interest in Jordan than simple manipulation. The boy would inherit Raymond's business if something happened to both parents. And Jordan, at 18, would be far easier to control than Raymond had ever been. Standing slowly, her arthritis always worsened when she was stressed, Marilyn walked to her kitchen window. Across the parking lot, she could see a familiar sedan with tinted windows. The same car had been parked there for 3 days, occupied by men who tried too hard to look casual. Preston Marshall's people, she realized. They were watching her. Marilyn felt a chill that had nothing to do with the autumn weather. Norman's debt situation was apparently more desperate than she'd realized. If Marshall's organization was monitoring potential sources of payment, then the timeline for their plan had accelerated. She needed to warn Raymond immediately. But when she tried calling his cell phone, it went directly to voicemail. His office number was answered by an automated system. And when she called the house, Jordan answered with a tone that suggested he'd been coached on what to say. "Dad's out of the country, Grandma. Some emergency contract in Prague. He won't be back for 2 weeks." 2 weeks. Enough time for Norman and Karen to implement whatever plan they developed. Enough time for an old woman who discovered too much to have an unfortunate accident. Marilyn had faced down Luftwaffe bombers over London. She'd buried husbands, raised children through poverty and uncertainty, and survived 7 decades of life's accumulated tragedies. She wasn't about to be intimidated by some gambling addict and his collection of muscle-bound debt collectors. But she was practical enough to understand the danger. Norman Hansen was desperate, and desperate men made increasingly terrible decisions. If he believed that Marilyn posed a threat to his survival, he would eliminate that threat with whatever means were available. Walking to her bedroom, Marilyn retrieved the shoebox from her closet. Inside, wrapped in tissue paper, was Theodore's service revolver, a .38 special that he'd carried through Korea and kept maintained throughout their marriage. She'd learned to shoot during the war, when every civilian was expected to defend the homeland if the Germans invaded. Her hands, spotted with age but still steady, checked the cylinder and verified the ammunition. 6 rounds, which should be sufficient for any reasonable emergency. As she loaded the weapon, Marilyn thought about the phone call she'd made to Detective Stokes. Even if he took her seriously, police investigations moved slowly. By the time law enforcement gathered enough evidence to act, Norman's plan would be complete. No, if Raymond was going to be saved, it would have to be by someone who understood the stakes and was prepared to act decisively. Marilyn McConnell had defended her family through war, economic collapse, and personal tragedy. She wasn't about to stop now, even if it meant going to war with a man who thought that age and gender made her powerless. She'd spent 73 years learning that appearances could be deceiving. Norman Hansen was about to discover that the harmless old lady he'd dismissed as collateral damage was actually the most dangerous person in his carefully constructed plan. The war between predators was about to begin, and Marilyn McConnell intended to fire the first shot. Chapter 4. The Perfect Frame. The Dulles International Airport departure lounge hummed with the familiar chaos of international travel. Raymond Barber sat in the business class waiting area, studying his boarding pass for the Prague flight while simultaneously monitoring the reflection in the window behind him. 3 seats away, a man in a wrinkled suit pretended to read a newspaper while photographing Raymond with a camera disguised as a pen. Norman's surveillance team was competent but not exceptional. Raymond had identified 2 watchers in the parking garage, one in the terminal entrance, and now this amateur with the obvious camera. They were documenting his departure, creating an official record that Raymond Barber had left the country at 6:47 p.m. on November 15th. What they didn't know was that Raymond had never intended to board the plane. Final boarding call for United Flight 347 to Prague, the gate agent announced. Raymond stood, shouldering his carry-on bag and walking toward the gate. The watcher with the newspaper followed at a discreet distance, no doubt relieved that his surveillance assignment was nearly complete. Raymond presented his boarding pass, walked down the jetway, and disappeared from view. 15 minutes later, As Flight 347 taxied toward the runway, Raymond emerged from a maintenance corridor in the lower level of the terminal. The prog flight manifest would show Raymond Barber in seat 4A. The surveillance team would report successful departure, and Norman Hansen would believe he had the perfect alibi for murder. Luther Gibbons was waiting in the parking garage with a nondescript sedan and a tablet displaying real-time surveillance feeds from Raymond's house. They moved faster than expected, Luther said as Raymond slid into the passenger seat. Norman's already at the house. Karen sent Jordan to a friend's place for the night. Raymond watched the feed from his kitchen security camera. Norman and Karen were sitting at his dining room table, presumably finalizing their plans for Marilyn McConnell's murder. The audio feed captured fragments of conversation, discussion of timing, cleanup procedures, and Jordan's eventual testimony. "What about the old woman?" Raymond asked, still at her apartment. "But Marshall's people are positioned around the building. I count at least 4 surveillance positions." Raymond processed this information with cold calculation. Marilyn McConnell had been investigating Norman for months, gathering evidence that could destroy their carefully constructed frame. She represented the only real threat to their plan, which meant she would die tonight, unless Raymond prevented it. "Change of plans," Raymond said. "We're going to save the old woman." Luther looked surprised. "I thought we were letting this play out, gathering evidence for the counter-operation." "I was," Raymond admitted. "But Marilyn McConnell doesn't deserve to die for their ambitions. And dead martyrs make poor witnesses." The drive to Alexandria took 37 minutes through late evening traffic. Raymond used the time to study building schematics on Luther's tablet, identifying entry points, escape routes, and potential complications. Marilyn's apartment building was a mid-rise structure from the 1960s, with minimal security and multiple access points, perfect for the kind of operation that Marshall's people specialized in. "There," Luther said, pointing to a parked van near the building's entrance. 2 more vehicles on the perimeter, and at least 1 team inside the building. Raymond counted 6 potential hostiles, armed and positioned for a quick extraction after eliminating their target. Professional work, but not military grade. These were debt collectors who'd graduated to murder, dangerous but predictable. "Equipment?" Raymond asked. Luther handed him a small duffel bag. Suppressed pistol, tactical knife, flashbangs, and emergency medical supplies, plus communication gear and building access codes. Raymond changed clothes in the sedan's back seat, trading his business suit for dark tactical gear that would blend with shadows and absorb sound. As he checked his weapons, he felt the familiar transformation taking place. The security consultant disappearing, replaced by the predator who'd operated in a dozen war zones. "Overwatch position?" he asked. "Building across the street, 3rd floor. I've got clear sight lines and digital control of the target building systems." Raymond exited the vehicle and melted into the night. 20 years of covert operations had taught him to move through urban environments like a ghost, invisible to cameras and unnoticed by casual observers. He circled the building twice, identifying the positions of Marshall's watchers and memorizing their patrol patterns. The first hostile was positioned in the parking garage, monitoring the building's rear entrance. Raymond approached from behind, using concrete pillars for concealment. The man never heard him coming. "Luther, 1 down," Raymond whispered into his throat mic. "Copy." 2 hostiles in the lobby, 1 on the 7th floor outside the target's apartment. Raymond moved through the building's service areas, using maintenance corridors and emergency stairs to avoid the lobby. The elevator shaft provided access to the upper floors, and Raymond climbed the cables with the fluid efficiency of someone who'd infiltrated buildings in Beirut and Baghdad. The 7th floor was carpeted and well lit, with no obvious concealment. But Raymond had operated in hostile territory where any mistake meant death. He waited in the stairwell, timing the patrol patterns of the man outside Marilyn's apartment. When the hostile turned away, Raymond moved. The tactical knife entered between the 3rd and 4th ribs, angled upward to pierce the heart. The man died instantly, without sound or struggle. Raymond caught the body and dragged it into an empty apartment, using lockpicks that Luther had provided. "Floor secured," he reported. Marilyn McConnell answered her door on the second knock, despite the late hour. She was fully dressed and holding a .38 special with the competent grip of someone who'd learned to shoot during wartime. "Mrs. McConnell," Raymond said quietly. "I'm here to help." Recognition dawned in her blue eyes. "Raymond? But you're supposed to be in Prague. That's what they want everyone to believe. May I come in?" Marilyn stepped aside, lowering her weapon but not holstering it. "I've been trying to reach you for days. Your daughter and that man. They're planning something terrible." "I know," Raymond said. "They're planning to kill you tonight and frame me for your murder." Marilyn's expression hardened. "Then we'd better make sure their plan fails." Raymond felt a grudging respect for the old woman. At 73, facing professional killers, she was calm and focused. "Do you have somewhere safe to go? Family out of state? I have a sister in Maine. But running away won't solve this problem." "No," Raymond agreed. "It won't, but staying alive long enough to testify will." Luther's voice crackled through Raymond's earpiece. Movement in the lobby. "The remaining team is heading up." Raymond moved to the window, peering through the blinds at the street below. 2 more vehicles had arrived, disgorging additional personnel. Marshall was apparently taking no chances with this operation. "Mrs. McConnell, we need to leave. Now." "Wait," Marilyn said, retrieving a manila envelope from her dining room table. "I've been investigating Mr. Hansen for months. Financial records, business connections, evidence of his gambling debts. Everything you'll need to prove their conspiracy." Raymond accepted the envelope, recognizing the value of Marilyn's research. "Thank you. Now, can you climb stairs?" "Young man, I survived the London Blitz. I can climb stairs." They exited through the apartment's balcony, using emergency fire escapes to reach the roof. From there, Raymond led Marilyn across adjacent buildings, moving through shadows and avoiding the searchlights that now swept the area below. "Are you really a security consultant?" Marilyn asked as they navigated a particularly challenging gap between buildings. "Among other things," Raymond replied. 20 minutes later, they reached Luther's overwatch position. Marilyn accepted coffee and blankets while Raymond studied the surveillance feeds from his house. Norman and Karen were still there, waiting for confirmation that the old woman was dead. They were about to be very disappointed. "Luther, patch me through to Norman's cell phone." The call connected after 3 rings. "Norman Hansen." "Norman," Raymond said, his voice carrying the cold authority of a man who'd pronounced death sentences in a dozen languages. "This is Raymond. I believe you've been looking for me." The silence stretched for nearly 10 seconds before Norman found his voice. "Raymond? I thought you were in Prague. Change of plans. I'm actually sitting here with Marilyn McConnell, reviewing some very interesting financial documents. She's quite the investigator." Another silence, longer this time. "I don't know what you think you've discovered," Norman finally said, "but I think," Raymond interrupted, "that you and my wife have been planning my murder. I think you've manipulated my son into believing I'm a monster. And I think you sent Preston Marshall's people to kill an innocent old woman because she threatened to expose your plan. You're paranoid, Raymond. The stress of your work." "Norman," Raymond said quietly, "I want you to listen very carefully. I know what you are. I know what you've done. And I know what you were planning to do. In exactly 72 hours, you're going to wish you'd never met the Barber family." Raymond ended the call and turned to Marilyn, who was watching him with new understanding. "You're not really a consultant at all, are you?" she said. "No, ma'am. I'm something much more dangerous." And for the first time in months, Raymond Barber smiled. Chapter 5. The Web Titans. The secure conference room beneath Barber Consulting hummed with electronic activity as Raymond's team assembled for what Luther had dubbed Operation Family Reunion. The walls were lined with monitors displaying surveillance feeds, financial records, and tactical plans that would have made Pentagon strategists envious. Marilyn McConnell sat at the head of the conference table, her silver hair catching the overhead lights as she studied the evidence spread before her. In the 36 hours since Raymond had extracted her from her apartment, she'd become an integral part of the operation, part witness, part tactical advisor, and part moral compass for men who'd forgotten the difference between justice and revenge. "Preston Marshall's organization is larger than we initially assessed," Wade Duke reported, his scarred face impassive as he pointed to organizational charts on the main screen. At 48, Wade had the kind of weathered appearance that spoke of hard years and harder choices. He'd spent the morning infiltrating Marshall's operation, posing as a potential client seeking debt collection services. 47 active personnel, split between surveillance, enforcement, and financial operations, Wade continued. Annual revenue estimated at $12 million, with assets including warehouses, safe houses, and a private airfield in Maryland. Raymond studied the intelligence with professional interest. Marshall's organization was more sophisticated than typical street-level debt collection, with connections to political figures and law enforcement officials who provided protection in exchange for campaign contributions and personal favors. What about Norman's specific debt? Raymond asked. Luther pulled up financial records on his laptop. $73,000 in principal, but with Marshall's interest rates and penalty fees, it's approaching $120,000. Payment was due yesterday, which explains the escalated timeline, Marilyn observed. Norman must be desperate. Raymond nodded, appreciating the old woman's analytical mind. Luther, show her the surveillance from last night. The main screen displayed footage from multiple cameras positioned around Raymond's house. Norman and Karen were visible in the kitchen, their body language revealing stress and disagreement. The audio feed captured fragments of heated conversation. Told you he was supposed to be in Prague. Marshall's people failed. That's not my fault. Jordan starting to ask questions. Need to move faster before Raymond. Marilyn leaned forward, studying her daughter's face on the monitor. She's frightened, she said quietly. Karen's always been emotional when she's scared, and she's terrified right now. Good, Raymond said without emotion. Fear makes people careless. What about Jordan? Marilyn asked. That boy doesn't deserve to be destroyed by their mistakes. Raymond's expression darkened. Jordan made his choice when he agreed to testify against me, when he chose Norman over his own father. He's 18 years old and manipulated by adults he trusted, Marilyn countered. Children make mistakes. This isn't a mistake, Raymond said coldly. This is betrayal. And I don't forgive betrayal, regardless of age. Wade Duke cleared his throat. We've confirmed that Norman has been coaching Jordan for months, providing him with fabricated evidence about Raymond's overseas activities. Phone records showed daily conversations between them, often lasting over an hour. The tactical display showed a new set of surveillance photos. Jordan meeting with Norman at various locations around D.C., accepting envelopes that presumably contained money or fake documents, being coached on testimony that would destroy his father's reputation and freedom. The boy genuinely believes Raymond is a killer, Luther added. Norman's been very thorough in his manipulation. Raymond stood, walking to the window that overlooked the Potomac. Then Jordan will learn the truth about killers. Up close and personal. Raymond, Marilyn said carefully, revenge against your wife and her lover is understandable. But destroying your own son. He's not my son anymore, Raymond interrupted. The moment he chose their side, he became another target. The room fell silent. Wade Duke and Luther Gibbons exchanged glances, recognizing the tone that meant Raymond had moved beyond strategy into the cold calculus of elimination. They'd seen this transformation before in operations where enemies had threatened something Raymond valued. The difference was that this time, the enemies included his own family. Sir, Luther said carefully, we've prepared the packages you requested. Complete dossiers on all targets, plus documentation of their conspiracy. Raymond returned to the table, accepting a sealed envelope that contained the culmination of months of investigation. Financial records proving Norman's desperation, surveillance footage documenting the affair, phone intercepts revealing the conspiracy, and evidence of Marshall's involvement in the planned murder. Timeline, Raymond asked. Norman has 48 hours before Marshall takes direct action, Wade reported. Based on our intelligence, that action will involve physical punishment followed by forced asset liquidation. And Karen, she's scheduled to file for divorce tomorrow morning, using domestic violence allegations to freeze your assets and gain custody of the business, Luther said. Norman's coached her on testimony that portrays you as an unstable killer who who's threatened her life. Raymond smiled, the expression containing no warmth. Perfect. She'll be making her opening move just as we spring our trap. Marilyn studied Raymond's face, seeing something that reminded her of her first husband during the war, the cold determination of a man who'd crossed lines that couldn't be uncrossed. What exactly are you planning? Justice, Raymond said simply. They want to destroy Raymond Barber, the family man. Tomorrow, they'll meet the other Raymond Barber, and they'll learn why 20 years of marriage was the only thing keeping them safe. The monitors around the room continued their silent surveillance, documenting the final hours of ignorance for 3 people who declared war on a man trained to fight wars. Norman Hansen continued his nervous pacing, unaware that his every movement was being recorded. Karen Barber made phone calls to attorneys and insurance agents, believing she was securing her future. Jordan Barber attended his final day of high school, prepared to testify against a father he'd never really known. One more thing, Raymond said, turning to Wade Duke. I want Preston Marshall to understand that his organization has made a serious error in judgment. Can you arrange a demonstration? Wade's scarred face shifted into what might have been a smile. What kind of demonstration? The kind that makes professional criminals reconsider their career choices. As the meeting concluded, Marilyn remained behind, studying the man her daughter had married 20 years ago. The Raymond Barber she'd known had been quiet, polite, and devoted to his family. The man before her now was something entirely different, a predator who'd temporarily adopted human emotions, but was now reverting to his true nature. Raymond, she said quietly, when this is over, what kind of man will you be? He considered the question with the same analytical precision he'd applied to the tactical planning. The kind of man who survives, Mrs. McConnell. The kind of man who makes sure his enemies don't get second chances. And Jordan, Raymond's eyes met hers, and Marilyn saw something that made her blood run cold. Jordan chose his side. Tomorrow, he'll learn what that choice costs. As Raymond left the conference room, Marilyn sat alone with the surveillance monitors, watching her family prepare for a war they couldn't possibly win. She wanted to save her daughter from a bad relationship. Instead, she'd triggered a conflict that would destroy everyone she loved. The last honest person in the room, she finally understood what Raymond's enemies had never realized. Some predators only appeared human. When threatened, they reverted to their true nature. And Raymond Barber's true nature was the kind of thing that gave nightmares to other nightmares. Chapter 6. The Trap Springs. The Arlington County Courthouse buzzed with morning activity as attorneys, plaintiffs, and defendants moved through its marble corridors like pieces on a chessboard. Karen Barber sat in her lawyer's office on the 3rd floor, signing documents that would irrevocably alter the trajectory of her life. She wore a conservative navy suit that suggested respectability and vulnerability, her auburn hair pulled back to emphasize the bruises that Norman had carefully applied with makeup to support their domestic violence narrative. Mrs. Barber, her attorney said, reviewing the restraining order petition one final time, I need to ask again, are you absolutely certain about these allegations? Once we file, there's no taking them back. Karen met his gaze with practiced sincerity. My husband is a dangerous man, Mr. Conrad. I've lived in fear for months, and after what happened to my mother, I can't wait any longer. The attorney, Mike Conrad, a specialist in high-stakes divorce cases, had been carefully selected for his reputation and his fee structure. Norman had provided $50,000 as a retainer, money that Conrad assumed came from Karen's family savings but had actually been borrowed against the life insurance policy that would soon pay out $2 million. The evidence you've provided is compelling, Conrad admitted, studying photos of the manufactured bruises and forged medical records. But your husband's business assets are substantial. He'll fight this aggressively. Let him fight, Karen said, channeling the righteous anger that Norman had taught her to project. I have witnesses, documentation, and a son who's afraid of his own father. 3 blocks away, Norman Hansen sat in his office, pretending to work while monitoring police scanners and news feeds for reports of Marilyn McConnell's death. The silence was becoming troubling. Marshall's people should have completed their assignment 36 hours ago, but there had been no confirmation No news reports, no contact from the cleanup crew. His secure phone buzzed with a text from Preston Marshall. Need to discuss payment schedule. 1 hour. Norman felt his stomach tighten. Marshall wasn't known for rescheduling meetings, and the terse message suggested that patience was running thin. The original timeline had allowed for Marilyn's death to occur simultaneously with Raymond's overseas alibi, followed by a week of police investigation before Karen filed for divorce. Now, everything was accelerating beyond Norman's ability to control. He tried calling the surveillance team leader, but reached only voicemail. The backup contact number was disconnected, and when he drove past Marilyn's apartment building, he found no sign of Marshall's people, just normal neighborhood activity and a maintenance crew replacing security cameras. Something had gone wrong, badly wrong. At Arlington High School, Jordan Barber was experiencing his own crisis of confidence. The testimony that Norman had coached him to deliver, stories of his father's violent behavior, evidence of domestic abuse, details of Raymond's suspicious overseas activities, had seemed believable when rehearsed in Norman's office. But now, faced with the reality of destroying his father's life, Jordan was beginning to question the narrative he'd been fed. "You ready for this?" asked his girlfriend, Becky Bruce, as they sat in the school parking lot during lunch break. "I mean, testifying against your own dad?" Jordan stared at his hands, remembering the carefully staged photographs that Norman had shown him, images that supposedly depicted Raymond at crime scenes, documents that suggested involvement in illegal activities, recordings of conversations that portrayed a man capable of murder. But something felt wrong about the evidence, inconsistencies that his 18-year-old mind was finally beginning to recognize. "What if I'm wrong?" he asked quietly. "Wrong about what?" "About my dad. What if he's not the person Norman says he is?" Becky studied her boyfriend's troubled expression. "Jordan, you've been telling me for months that you're afraid of your father, that he's violent and dangerous. Now you're having second thoughts." "I don't know," Jordan admitted. I've never actually seen him hurt anyone. And some of the evidence Norman showed me, it doesn't quite add up." Before Becky could respond, Jordan's phone buzzed with a text from Norman. "Meeting tonight to review testimony. Don't discuss case with anyone." Jordan stared at the message, feeling the weight of adult expectations and adolescent uncertainty. Tomorrow, he would sit in a courtroom and destroy his father's reputation with words that Norman had carefully placed in his mouth. But for the first time, he was beginning to wonder if those words were true. Back at the courthouse, Karen's divorce filing was proceeding smoothly. The restraining order had been approved, freezing Raymond's assets and prohibiting him from contacting his wife or son. The domestic violence allegations would be investigated, and given the evidence that Norman had manufactured, Raymond would likely face criminal charges in addition to civil proceedings. "One more signature," Conrad said, sliding a final document across his desk. "This authorizes immediate asset seizure based on the domestic violence findings." Karen signed with a flourish, unaware that surveillance cameras in the building were recording her every movement. She believed she was securing her future. In reality, she was providing evidence of her own conspiracy. As she left the courthouse, Karen's phone rang. Norman's name appeared on the caller ID. "It's done," she reported. "Raymond's assets are frozen, and the restraining order is in effect." "Good," Norman said, but his voice carried undertones of stress that Karen had learned to recognize. "We need to meet tonight. There have been some complications." "What kind of complications?" "The kind we'll discuss in person. Bring Jordan." The call ended, leaving Karen standing on the courthouse steps with a growing sense of unease. The plan had been meticulous, every detail rehearsed and verified. But Norman's tone suggested that something had shifted, some variable that they hadn't anticipated. She didn't know that Raymond was watching her from a surveillance van across the street, documenting her every movement and recording her phone conversations. She didn't know that Marshall's enforcement team had been neutralized before they could harm her mother. And she certainly didn't know that the man she'd been married to for 20 years was not the security consultant she'd thought she was betraying. As Karen drove away from the courthouse, confident in her victory, Raymond's voice crackled through the surveillance team's radio. "Phase 1 complete. All targets have committed to their positions. Begin Phase 2. In the federal building downtown, a sealed envelope was being delivered to Judge Theodore McKenna's chambers. The envelope bore official classification markings and required personal signature for receipt. Inside, Judge McKenna would find documentation that would fundamentally alter his understanding of the case about to appear on his docket. The trap had been sprung, and now Raymond's enemies would discover what happened when ordinary criminals declared war on a man who fought wars for a living. Chapter 7. The Envelope. Judge Theodore McKenna had presided over federal court for 15 years, handling cases that ranged from white-collar fraud to domestic terrorism. At 59, his silver hair and weathered face reflected the weight of decisions that had sent men to prison and occasionally to death row. He'd seen corruption, violence, and betrayal in their most sophisticated forms, but nothing had prepared him for the contents of the sealed envelope that arrived at his chambers on the morning of November 18th. The envelope bore classification markings that McKenna recognized from his early career as a military prosecutor. Eyes only, compartmented intelligence, national security. The delivery had been made by a courier who'd required biometric verification and had waited while McKenna signed acknowledgement forms that carried the weight of federal law. Margaret, McKenna called to his clerk, clear my calendar for the next hour, and activate the secure conference protocols. Margaret Patterson, who'd worked for Judge McKenna since his appointment to the bench, recognized the tone that meant classified business. She activated the electronic countermeasures that would prevent surveillance of the judge's chambers and clear the outer office of all personnel. Alone in his office, McKenna broke the wax seal and extracted a folder that contained materials he'd hoped never to encounter outside of his military service. The cover sheet bore the letterhead of an agency that officially didn't exist, signed by a deputy director whose name appeared on no public documents. Judge McKenna. The materials in this folder pertain to an active national security operation that has been compromised by criminal conspiracy. Agent Raymond Barber, cover identity, security consultant, has been operating under deep cover for the past 8 years, conducting classified operations against terrorist networks and foreign intelligence services. Agent Barber's cover has been penetrated by domestic criminals who have recruited his family members in a conspiracy to murder Agent Barber and steal classified materials. The attached evidence documents this conspiracy and requests your immediate intervention to preserve national security. This matter falls under the authority of the Foreign Intelligence Surveillance Court and carries presidential authorization for extraordinary measures. McKenna set down the cover letter and began reviewing the supporting documentation. Surveillance footage showed Karen Barber and Norman Hansen planning the murder of Marilyn McConnell. Financial records proved Norman's gambling debts and his conspiracy to steal Raymond's business assets. Phone intercepts captured Jordan Barber being coached to provide false testimony against his father. But the most disturbing material dealt with Raymond's actual work. For 8 years, while posing as a security consultant, Raymond had been eliminating high-value targets in support of American foreign policy. The targets included terrorist leaders, arms dealers, and foreign agents who threatened national security. The operations had been authorized at the highest levels of government and had saved countless American lives. Now that classified operation was threatened by a gambling addict and an unfaithful wife who had no idea what they were really trying to steal. McKenna's secure phone rang. Judge McKenna, this is Deputy Director Russell Bean. Have you reviewed the materials? I'm still processing them, McKenna admitted. The scope of this conspiracy is substantial. Judge, I need you to understand the stakes. Agent Barber has been operating under non-official cover for nearly a decade. His client list includes every major defense contractor and intelligence service in the Western Hemisphere. If that information falls into the wrong hands, it could compromise operations spanning 3 continents. McKenna studied photographs of Norman Hansen meeting with Preston Marshall's organization. These criminals, do they understand what they're dealing with? They think they're stealing a lucrative consulting business. They have no idea they're attempting to compromise a classified intelligence operation. And Agent Barber? What's his status? Officially, Agent Barber is in Prague conducting routine business. Unofficially, he's in D.C. conducting damage control. McKenna understood the implication. Damage control in intelligence operations often involve permanent solutions to security breaches. What do you need from me? Agent Barber will be appearing in your courtroom this afternoon, accused of domestic violence and conspiracy to commit murder. I need you to ensure that national security takes precedence over domestic proceedings. That's highly irregular, McKenna said carefully. I can't simply dismiss legitimate charges. The charges aren't legitimate, Bean replied. They're part of the conspiracy to frame Agent Barber. The evidence in your folder proves that conclusively. McKenna reviewed the materials again, focusing on the timeline of events. The frame-up had been sophisticated, involving forged evidence, manufactured testimony, and the manipulation of multiple family members. But it had been constructed by amateurs who hadn't realized they were targeting a professional intelligence operative. What about the family members? McKenna asked. The wife and son? That's Agent Barber's decision. But I should note that they've committed federal crimes by conspiring against a classified operation. The penalties for those crimes are severe. McKenna set down the phone and walked to his window, looking out at the city where he'd spent his career upholding justice. The case before him transcended normal legal proceedings. It involved national security, family betrayal, and the question of where justice ended and revenge began. At 2:47 p.m., his bailiff announced the arrival of the defendant. Your Honor, Raymond Barber is here for the emergency domestic violence hearing. Send him in, McKenna said, and activate the secure protocols. Raymond entered the courtroom wearing handcuffs and the orange jumpsuit of the Arlington County Jail. But McKenna, who'd reviewed classified files detailing Raymond's actual activities, saw past the costume to the professional underneath. This was a man who'd eliminated terrorist leaders in a dozen countries, who'd operated behind enemy lines for months at a time, who'd sacrificed normal family life in service to his country. And his own family had tried to destroy him for money. Mr. Barber, McKenna said formally, you're charged with domestic violence and conspiracy to commit murder. How do you plead? Not guilty, Your Honor. Karen Barber sat in the gallery with her attorney, confident in her victory. Jordan sat beside her, still struggling with doubts about his testimony. Norman Hansen occupied the back row, calculating the value of the business assets he would soon control. None of them noticed the additional security personnel who'd quietly entered the courtroom. None of them recognized the subtle hand signals between the bailiffs. And none of them understood that the man they tried to frame had spent years preparing for exactly this kind of threat. Before we proceed, McKenna announced, I need to review some additional evidence that has come to my attention. He held up the sealed envelope, watching the faces in the gallery. Norman Hansen's expression shifted from confidence to confusion. Karen's manufactured composure began to crack. Jordan looked between his mother and the judge, sensing that something fundamental was about to change. Mr. Barber, McKenna said, would you care to explain what's in this envelope? Raymond met the judge's eyes, and McKenna saw the cold calculation of a man who'd moved beyond law into the realm of necessary violence. Your Honor, that envelope contains the truth about who I really am, what my family has done, and what happens next. McKenna opened the envelope and removed a single sheet of paper. The document was brief, bearing multiple classification stamps and signature blocks that represented the highest levels of American intelligence. It says here, McKenna read aloud, that Raymond Barber is a federal agent operating under deep cover, and that the charges against him constitute a conspiracy to compromise national security. The courtroom erupted. Karen Barber screamed denials. Norman Hansen bolted for the exit, only to find his path blocked by federal marshals. Jordan sat in stunned silence, finally understanding the magnitude of his betrayal. It also says, McKenna continued, his voice cutting through the chaos, that I am authorized to take extraordinary measures to protect this classified operation. He looked directly at Raymond. Agent Barber, what do you recommend? Raymond's smile contained 20 years of suppressed fury. Your Honor, I recommend we lock the doors. No one leaves until we've sorted this out. McKenna nodded to his bailiff. Lock the doors. No one leaves. 10 seconds later, armed operatives filled the room. Chapter 8. The Reckoning. The federal courthouse had been transformed into an interrogation facility within minutes of Judge McKenna's order. Armed operatives from Raymond's organization secured all exits, while electronic countermeasures specialists jammed communications and activated recording equipment. The marble corridors that had witnessed decades of legal proceedings now echoed with the efficient movements of professionals conducting a very different kind of justice. In conference room A, Norman Hansen sat handcuffed to a metal chair, his expensive suit wrinkled and his face pale with the realization that his carefully constructed plan had collapsed catastrophically. Across from him, Wade Duke reviewed a tablet displaying Norman's complete financial history, from his early gambling losses to his recent meetings with Preston Marshall's organization. $73,000 in gambling debts, Wade said conversationally. That's a lot of money for a man with your legitimate income. Norman's attorney had been excluded from the proceedings under national security provisions, leaving him alone with interrogators who operated outside normal legal constraints. I want to call my lawyer, he said for the fourth time. Your lawyer can't help you now, Wade replied. You're not being charged with domestic crimes anymore. You're being investigated for conspiracy against a classified intelligence operation. In the adjacent room, Karen Barber faced Luther Gibbons, whose laptop displayed months of surveillance footage documenting her affair with Norman. The evidence was overwhelming. Hotel receipts, restaurant charges, phone records that painted a complete picture of adultery and conspiracy. 20 years of marriage, Luther observed, scrolling through financial records. 20 years of Raymond providing for you and Jordan, traveling overseas for work that you never questioned. And you repay him by planning his murder. Karen's composure had shattered when the federal marshals had taken her into custody. The makeup that had concealed her fake bruises was now streaked with tears, and her carefully styled hair hung limp around her face. I didn't know, she whispered. I didn't know what Raymond really did. You didn't care, Luther corrected. You saw the money, the lifestyle, the opportunities. You just decided you wanted them with a different man. In conference room C, Jordan Barber sat across from Marilyn McConnell, his grandmother who'd supposedly been murdered 3 days ago. The revelation that she was alive and that the entire frame-up had been exposed had sent the 18-year-old into shock. Grandma, he said, his voice breaking, I thought you were dead. I thought Dad killed you. Marilyn studied her grandson with sad eyes. Norman showed you evidence, didn't he? Photographs, documents, recordings that prove your father was a killer. Jordan nodded miserably. He said Dad was dangerous, that he was planning to hurt you and Mom. He showed me police reports, surveillance photos. All fabricated, Marilyn said gently. Norman Hansen is a con artist who manipulated you into betraying your own father. But the evidence can be manufactured by people who know what they're doing. Norman needed you to believe those lies so you'd testify against Raymond. He turned you into a weapon against your own family. Jordan buried his face in his hands. I've destroyed everything. Dad will never forgive me. Marilyn reached across the table, touching her grandson's shoulder. Raymond is not a forgiving man, Jordan, especially not when it comes to betrayal. In the main conference room, Raymond Barber stood before a wall of monitors displaying the complete scope of the conspiracy against him. Judge McKenna sat at the head of the conference table, reviewing classified documents that detailed Raymond's actual activities over the past 8 years. 47 confirmed eliminations, McKenna read from Raymond's service record. Operations conducted in 12 countries, with a mission success rate of 100%. No collateral damage, no compromised operations, no exposure of American assets. Until now, Raymond said quietly. Deputy Director Russell Bean joined them via secure video link from Langley. Agent Barber, what's your assessment of the security breach? Raymond considered the question with professional detachment. Norman Hansen gained access to client lists, financial records, and operational patterns. He doesn't understand their significance, but he has enough information to compromise multiple ongoing operations. And the family members? Karen has been feeding information to Norman for 8 months. She has access to travel schedules, communication patterns, and business relationships. Jordan has been coached to testify about activities he's observed but didn't understand. Bean's expression hardened. Recommendations? Raymond looked at the monitors showing his wife, son, and business partner in separate interrogation rooms. 20 years of marriage, 18 years of fatherhood, and 3 years of professional partnership, all destroyed by greed and manipulation. Norman Hansen is a clear security risk, Raymond said. He has gambling debts to organized crime, and he's demonstrated willingness to commit murder for financial gain. He cannot be allowed to retain his knowledge of classified operations. Agreed. What about your wife? Karen is emotionally compromised and has demonstrated poor judgment in her choice of allies. She's also shown willingness to participate in murder conspiracies for financial gain. And your son? Raymond was quiet for a long moment. Jordan is 18 years old and legally an adult. He chose to testify against me based on manufactured evidence, but he made that choice of his own free will. Judge McKenna looked up from the classified documents. Agent Barber, are you requesting authorization for termination of all 3 targets? The question hung in the air like smoke from a funeral pyre. In the interrogation rooms, 3 people who believed they were destroying a simple security consultant waited to learn their fate from a man who'd spent years making similar decisions about enemies of the state. Norman Hansen has committed federal crimes and poses an ongoing security risk, Raymond said finally. He's also deeply indebted to criminal organizations that specialize in violence. I recommend he be allowed to face the natural consequences of his choices. Bean nodded. Preston Marshall's organization has been waiting for payment. We could simply let them know where to find Mr. Hansen. What about your wife and son? McKenna asked. Raymond studied the monitors showing Karen and Jordan in their separate rooms. His wife was still crying, finally understanding the magnitude of her betrayal. His son sat in stunned silence, grappling with the realization that he'd been manipulated into destroying his own family. They chose their side, Raymond said with the cold finality of a man pronouncing sentence. They'll live with the consequences. Which are? Raymond's smile was winter cold. I'm Raymond Barber, security consultant. As of today, I'm divorcing my unfaithful wife and disowning my traitorous son. They'll receive nothing from me. No money, no protection, no mercy. And your other identity? Doesn't officially exist, Raymond replied. But the man who doesn't exist has a long memory and holds grudges for a very long time. Bean nodded approvingly. I'll arrange for Mr. Hansen to be released into Preston Marshall's custody. Natural consequences, as you said. What about the wife and son? McKenna asked. They'll face federal charges for conspiracy against a classified operation, Bean said. But given their cooperation during interrogation and Agent Barber's recommendation for leniency, they'll likely receive probation and permanent surveillance. Raymond turned away from monitors, no longer interested in watching his former family grapple with their fate. I have one final request. Yes, I want 10 minutes alone with each of them. To say goodbye. Judge McKenna and Deputy Director Bean exchanged glances. They'd both seen Raymond's psychological profile, and they understood what saying goodbye might entail for a man who'd spent years killing enemies of the state. Granted, Bean said. Take all the time you need. As Raymond left the conference room, heading toward the interrogation facilities where his family waited, Marilyn McConnell approached Judge McKenna. Your Honor, she said quietly, I know Raymond's reputation, and I know what he's capable of. But those are still his wife and son in there. McKenna studied the old woman who'd triggered this entire sequence of events by investigating Norman Hansen. Mrs. McConnell, what exactly are you asking me to do? I'm asking you to remember that justice and revenge aren't always the same thing. McKenna nodded thoughtfully. I'll keep that in mind. But ultimately, this is Agent Barber's choice to make. As Marilyn watched Raymond disappear down the corridor toward the interrogation rooms, she wondered if she'd saved her family or simply delivered them to a more personal form of destruction. The man walking toward those rooms wasn't the security consultant who'd married her daughter 20 years ago. This was the other Raymond Barber, the one who'd never learned to forgive betrayal. Chapter 9. The Final Cut. Conference room. It had been cleared of recording equipment at Raymond's request, leaving only two chairs facing each other across a metal table. Norman Hansen looked up as Raymond entered, his handcuffs removed, but his options non-existent. The expensive suit that had once projected success now hung wrinkled and stained with sweat. "Raymond," Norman said, attempting his practice charm one final time. "We need to talk about this situation." Raymond sat across from the man who'd slept with his wife, manipulated his son, and planned his murder. After 20 years of maintaining the facade of a mild-mannered consultant, he finally allowed his true nature to show in his eyes. Norman Hansen, who'd spent his career reading people for advantage, recognized the look of a predator that had stopped pretending to be prey. "You have nothing to say that I want to hear," Raymond said quietly. "But I have things I want you to understand before you die." Norman's remaining composure cracked. "Die? Raymond, you can't just—" "Do you know what I do for a living, Norman?" "Why, I really do." "You're a security consultant. Government contracts, overseas work." "I kill people," Raymond interrupted. "For the past 8 years, I've eliminated 47 enemies of the United States. Terrorists, arms dealers, foreign agents. Men who threatened American interests were given to me, and I made them disappear." Norman stared across the table at a man he'd thought he knew. "That's impossible. You're just—" "Mild-mannered Raymond Barber, devoted family man?" Raymond smiled, the expression containing decades of suppressed violence. "That was my cover identity. The real Raymond Barber is the man who spent 6 months in Syria eliminating an entire terrorist cell. The man who walked into a Beirut safe house and killed 5 arms dealers with a soup spoon." "You're lying," Norman whispered. Raymond leaned forward. 3 months ago, I eliminated the leadership of a human trafficking network in Prague. The official reports said they died in a gang war. Actually, I poisoned them during a business dinner and watched them convulse to death over dessert." Norman's face had gone pale. "Why are you telling me this?" "Because I want you to understand what you tried to steal. You thought you were scamming a security consultant out of his client list. Actually, you were attempting to compromise a classified intelligence operation that has saved thousands of American lives." "I didn't know," Norman said desperately. "If I'd known, you would have done exactly the same thing," Raymond finished. "Because you're a parasite who feeds on other people's work. You seduced my wife, manipulated my son, and planned my murder because you're too weak to build anything of your own." Raymond stood, walking to the window that overlooked the courthouse parking lot. "Do you see that black sedan, Norman? The one with the tinted windows?" Norman followed his gaze to a vehicle that looked identical to dozens of others in the lot. "Preston Marshall's people have been waiting there for 3 hours," Raymond continued. "They know you're in federal custody, and they're very interested in discussing your overdue payment." "You can't turn me over to them," Norman said, panic creeping into his voice. "I have information about your operations, your clients." "No, you don't," Raymond said calmly. "You have fragments of information that you've completely misunderstood. You thought you were stealing a profitable consulting business. You were actually attempting to compromise a network that extends to every major intelligence service in the Western Hemisphere." Raymond returned to his chair, studying Norman with the detached interest of a scientist examining a particularly unpleasant specimen. "But don't worry about compromising state secrets, Norman. You won't live long enough to share what you've learned. The federal marshals won't let you." "The federal marshals are going to release you in approximately 10 minutes, Raymond interrupted. "There will be a brief paperwork error that delays your protective custody. During that delay, you'll walk out of this building and encounter Preston Marshall's debt collectors." Norman's breathing became rapid and shallow. "You planned this. The whole thing. You knew about our plan and let it happen." "I've known about your conspiracy for months," Raymond confirmed. "I could have stopped it at any time. Instead, I let you proceed until you'd committed enough federal crimes to justify your elimination." "Why?" Raymond considered the question. "Because I wanted you to understand the full scope of your mistake before you died. I wanted you to realize that you didn't betray a security consultant. You betrayed a professional killer who's been trained to eliminate threats to national security." He stood again, moving toward the door. "Goodbye, Norman. In about 15 minutes, you'll discover why smart criminals never target intelligence operatives. Wait, Norman called desperately. What about Karen? What about Jordan? Raymond paused at the door. They'll live, but they'll live knowing that they betrayed the man who spent 20 years protecting them. They'll live knowing that their greed and stupidity destroyed the only person who ever really loved them. And you? What happens to you? Raymond's smile was cold as winter. I go back to work. There are always more enemies to eliminate, more threats to neutralize. But now I do it without the distraction of a family that never deserved my protection. As Raymond left the room, Norman Hansen sat alone with the knowledge that he'd declared war on a man who fought wars for a living. In 10 minutes, he would walk out of the courthouse and into the hands of creditors who measured debt in blood and bones. He'd wanted to steal Raymond Barber's life. Instead, he learned what that life actually cost. Conference Room B was smaller, windowless, and filled with 20 years of broken promises. Karen Barber looked up as Raymond entered, her green eyes red-rimmed and desperate. The makeup that had concealed her fake bruises was gone, replaced by the authentic marks of genuine despair. "Raymond," she whispered, "please, we need to talk about this." Raymond sat across from the woman he'd married, the mother of his child, the person he'd trusted with secrets that could have destroyed him. "Talk about what, Karen? Your affair? Your conspiracy to murder me? Your manipulation of our son? I never meant for it to go this far," she said, reaching across the table. "Norman convinced me that you were dangerous, that you were planning to hurt us." Raymond pulled his hands away from her touch. "Stop lying. I've heard the recordings, Karen. I know exactly what you meant and how far you were willing to go." Karen's face crumpled. "I was scared, Raymond. You were gone all the time, and when you came back, you were different. Cold, distant. I needed someone who could be there for me. So you found Norman Hansen," Raymond said. "A gambling addict with $73,000 in debt to organized crime. A man so desperate that he was willing to commit murder for insurance money." "I didn't know about the gambling," Karen protested. "You didn't care about the gambling," Raymond corrected. "You saw an opportunity to get rid of an inconvenient husband and keep his money. Norman was just the tool you used." Karen stared at the man she'd married 20 years ago, searching for some trace of the gentle consultant who'd courted her with quiet persistence. "What are you going to do to me?" "Nothing," Raymond said simply. "You'll face federal charges for conspiracy against a classified operation. You'll probably get probation and permanent surveillance. You'll live. And us? Our marriage." Raymond's laugh was bitter. "There is no us, Karen. There's no marriage. There's just a woman who tried to murder her husband for money and a man who's finally learned what his wife is really worth." "What about Jordan? He's your son." "Jordan chose his side when he agreed to testify against me," Raymond interrupted. "He's 18 years old and legally an adult. He made an adult decision to betray his father." Karen began crying again, the tears streaming down her face as she grasped the full magnitude of what she'd lost. "Raymond, please. We can work through this. Counseling, therapy." "There's nothing to work through," Raymond said, standing to leave. "You're the mother of my child, so I won't kill you. But you're also the woman who planned my murder, so I'll never forgive you." "Then what happens now?" Raymond paused at the door. "Now you live with the consequences of your choices. You'll have no money, no protection, and no family. You'll spend the rest of your life knowing that you destroyed the only person who ever really loved you. And Norman Hansen will be dead within the hour," Raymond said matter-of-factly. "Preston Marshall's people don't forgive gambling debts, and they're very creative about collecting payment." Karen's eyes widened. "You're going to let them kill him?" "I'm not going to let them do anything," Raymond replied. "I'm simply not going to prevent the natural consequences of his choices." As Raymond left the room, Karen Barber sat alone with the wreckage of 20 years of marriage. She'd wanted everything: her husband's money, her lover's passion, and her son's loyalty. Instead, she'd lost everything, including the one man who'd ever truly protected her. The security consultant she'd married was gone forever, replaced by someone she'd never really known. Conference Room C held the most difficult conversation of Raymond's life. Jordan Barber looked up as his father entered, 18 years of shared memories hanging between them like smoke from a funeral pyre. The young man who'd once begged for bedtime stories now sat handcuffed to a chair, his auburn hair disheveled, and his eyes filled with the terrible understanding of absolute betrayal. "Dad," Jordan said quietly, "I'm sorry. I'm so sorry." Raymond studied his son, the boy he'd taught to ride a bike, the teenager he'd helped with homework, the young man he'd hoped to see graduate from college. "What exactly are you sorry for, Jordan? For believing them? For agreeing to testify against you? For not trusting you?" "You're not sorry for those things," Raymond said, sitting across from his son. "You're sorry you got caught." Jordan's face crumpled. "That's not true." "Dad, I thought you were going to hurt Mom and Grandma. Norman showed me evidence." "Fabricated evidence," Raymond interrupted. "Documents that any intelligent person would have questioned. Photographs that any critical thinker would have analyzed. But you didn't question anything, Jordan. You wanted to believe the worst about me. Why would I want that?" Raymond leaned back in his chair, studying the young man who'd inherited his analytical mind, but apparently none of his judgment. "Because it gave you permission to hate me for all the missed birthdays, all the canceled plans, all the times I chose work over family." Jordan stared at his hands. "I did resent you for being gone all the time. I was working to protect you," Raymond said quietly. "Everything I did, every mission I completed, every enemy I eliminated, it was all to make the world safer for you and your mother." "What did you really do, Dad? What was your actual job?" Raymond considered how much truth an 18-year-old could handle. "I killed people who threatened American interests. Terrorists, arms dealers, foreign agents. For 8 years, I've been eliminating enemies of the state." Jordan's eyes widened. "You're a government assassin?" "I'm a soldier in a war that most people don't know exists," Raymond corrected. "A war against people who would destroy everything you've taken for granted." "And Mom knew. Your mother knew that I worked for the government and that my job was classified. She chose not to ask questions because she enjoyed the lifestyle my work provided." Jordan sat in silence, processing the revelation that his father was exactly the kind of dangerous man that Norman had claimed, except that he'd been dangerous in service to his country, not against his family. "What happens now?" Jordan asked. Raymond stood, preparing to leave. "Now you live with the consequences of your choices. You're 18 years old and legally an adult. You chose to testify against your father based on manufactured evidence from a man you'd known for 8 months over a father you'd known your entire life." "But I was manipulated." "Adults get manipulated all the time," Raymond interrupted. "The difference is that adults take responsibility for their mistakes instead of blaming others." "Dad, please, can't we work through this? I'm your son." Raymond paused at the door, looking back at the young man who'd inherited his genes but not his character. "You were my son, Jordan, until you chose to testify against me. Now you're just another person who tried to destroy me and failed." "What does that mean?" "It means you'll face federal charges for conspiracy against a classified operation. It means you'll spend years under government surveillance. And it means you'll never see me again." Jordan began crying. Not the tears of a manipulated teenager, but the anguish of a young man who'd finally understood the magnitude of his betrayal. "Dad, I love you. I made a mistake, but I love you." Raymond studied his son's face, searching for any trace of the child he'd once read bedtime stories to. "Love isn't just an emotion, Jordan. It's a choice you make every day. When it mattered, when you had to choose between trusting me and believing a stranger, you chose the stranger." "I was 18 and scared." "I was 18 once too," Raymond said. "And I chose to serve my country rather than serve myself. You chose to serve your resentment rather than your family." As Raymond left the room, Jordan Barber sat alone with the knowledge that he'd destroyed the most important relationship in his life for the promise of money and the satisfaction of revenge. He'd wanted to punish his father for years of absence and neglect. Instead, he learned that some punishments destroyed the person delivering them. The father he'd testified against was gone forever, replaced by a stranger who measured love in loyalty and forgiveness in blood. Epilogue. 6 months later. The Prague safe house overlooked the Vltava River, its windows offering a commanding view of the ancient city's spires and bridges. Raymond Barber sat at a metal desk, reviewing mission files that contained the names and locations of enemies who would die in the coming weeks. At 43, he'd aged in ways that couldn't be measured in years. Harder, colder, stripped of the emotional connections that had once made him human. Luther Gibbons entered with coffee and updates from the United States. Norman Hansen's funeral was yesterday, he reported. Closed casket. Preston Marshall's people were very thorough. Raymond nodded without looking up from his files. Norman had lasted 3 days after his release from federal custody, longer than Raymond had expected, but not long enough to cause any real problems. The debt collectors had been creative in their collection methods, and Norman's death had served as a powerful message to other potential defaulters. What about the others? Raymond asked. Karen received 2 years probation and permanent surveillance. She's working as a hotel clerk in Richmond, Virginia. Jordan got 18 months probation and mandatory counseling. He's attending community college under federal monitoring. Raymond felt nothing at the news of his former family's fate. The man who'd once loved them had died in that courthouse, replaced by someone who understood that loyalty was a luxury that professional killers couldn't afford. Any contact attempts? He asked. Jordan sends letters to your former office address. Karen has tried calling through intermediaries. Your mother-in-law requested a meeting through official channels. Denied, Raymond said without hesitation. All of them. Luther nodded, understanding that Raymond's transformation was complete. The security consultant who'd maintained emotional connections was gone, replaced by the perfect intelligence operative, efficient, ruthless, and unburdened by personal attachments. Sir, Luther said carefully, there's something else. Marilyn McConnell has been asking questions about your well-being. She seems concerned about your mental state. Raymond looked up from his files, his gray eyes reflecting the winter light from the window. Mrs. McConnell is a remarkable woman who saved my operation by investigating Norman Hansen. But her concern is misplaced. Is it? Raymond considered the question with the same analytical precision he applied to target elimination. I'm exactly what I was trained to be, Luther. A weapon in human form. For 20 years, I pretended to be something else for the benefit of people who ultimately betrayed me. Now I can finally stop pretending. Luther studied his employer's face, recognizing the transformation that had taken place over the past 6 months. The man who'd once struggled to balance family obligations with professional duties was gone, replaced by someone who'd embraced his true nature without reservation or regret. The next target is confirmed, Luther reported, changing the subject. Arms dealer in Budapest, supplying weapons to terrorist networks across Eastern Europe. Raymond smiled, the expression containing no warmth but perfect satisfaction. Excellent. Schedule the elimination for next week. As Luther left the safe house, Raymond returned to his mission files. Somewhere in Virginia, his former wife served hotel guests and wondered what had become of the gentleman she'd married. Somewhere in the same state, his former son attended classes and wrote letters that would never be answered. They'd wanted to destroy Raymond Barber, the family man. They'd succeeded completely. Unfortunately for them, they never understood that beneath the family man was something far more dangerous. A predator who'd temporarily adopted human emotions, but never forgotten his true nature. The war was over. Raymond had won by losing everything that had once made him vulnerable. And in the ancient city of Prague, surrounded by the tools of his trade, Raymond Barber was finally completely free.
This is where our story comes to an end. Share your thoughts in the comments section. Thanks for your precious time. If you enjoyed this story, then please make sure you subscribe to this channel. That would help me a lot. Click on the video you see on the screen, and I will see you there.